Good evening, everyone, and welcome to each of you, whether you're present tonight or you're going to be listening to this class on a recording when it's convenient for you. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Sister Maria Viscusi. I'm the director of Spirit Alive, which is a ministry supported by my congregation, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York. We're able to provide these programs thanks to the support of the Sisters of St. Joseph and through donations. So let me begin with a few announcements, as I always do. If you're coming back, you've heard these a number of times. But anyway, first, for all 6 sessions of this course, as all Spirit Alive presentations, they will be recorded, and within approximately 72 hours after tonight's event, they will be put up on the Spirit Alive YouTube channel. So you can feel free to listen to them again, and know that if you have a conflict some Tuesday evening with the presentation, you can always view the recording. But please be patient. They don't go up immediately tonight. You'll get them within 72 hours. Also, you should have received an outline of tonight's presentation, and will be receiving an outline every week prior to the class, so you have an idea of what the content is and its unfolding. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. After the presentation, Evelyn will answer as many questions as possible. Then, depending on how many people come tonight, we might open it up in Zoom mode so that you can use your hand and raise it and ask questions directly. Finally, my congregation welcomes any donation you can make to support Spirit Alive, no matter the account. So there's information about donations on the Spirit Alive registration page, which you went to register for this program. Now, I'd like to introduce an old friend of mine, Evelyn Kirkley, Ph.D., who was a professor of theology and religious studies in the Theology and Religious Studies Department at the University of San Diego for 28 years, where I had the good fortune to be her colleague. She specializes in the religious history of the United States, with particular attention to Protestantism, minoritized and marginalized religious movements, and the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality with U.S. religion. Evelyn teaches with great enthusiasm and insight and was a student favorite. I'm so happy she's able to be with us for this course on Protestantism. Given what's going on in our country, I think we'd all like to know how and why Protestantism gave rise to the religious nationalism and environment that made it possible for Donald Trump's election, not once, but twice. So, Evelyn, with great gratitude and a warm welcome, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Well, it is wonderful to be with you. I do welcome questions, comments. The outline that you've received that I'm going to share with you in just a moment has my email address on it. If you think of a question tomorrow or during the week, please feel free to email me. I'll get to you as quickly as I can. The only other thing that I want to say by way of introduction about myself is that I did grow up in the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. That is the Southern Baptist Convention. It is today well known as an evangelical or even fundamentalist Protestant group. I now would describe myself, I'm a member of a Unitarian Universalist church. I have a Buddhist meditation practice. I'd throw a little nature religion in. We Southern Californians, I'm here in San Diego. And so it's a little bit eclectic, but I am speaking from personal experience. So I will be critical at times of the development of Protestantism in Europe and in the United States, but I'm speaking about my own former tribe. So with that, I am going to share my screen and get started for tonight. You can see my email address is ekirkley@sandiego.edu. And I wanted to start tonight by just mentioning why it's important to study Protestantism in the US. There are a couple of easy ways to think about it. How many US presidents have been Protestant? It's easier to say who have not been Protestant. Of the 46 men who have served as president of the US, 42 have claimed to have some sort of affiliation with a Protestant denomination. Some of you are probably aware that two US presidents have been Roman Catholic. That would be John F. Kennedy and Joseph Biden. And two presidents never had any kind of religious affiliation and kind of shunned having it. Interestingly, that was Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. But so there has been this Protestant power, particularly white Protestant power, that has been a shaping influence throughout the United States. And we're going to begin with the origins, and we're going to go all the way up to the question of why Christian nationalists are overwhelmingly white and Protestant and supporters of our current president. Another easy way to think about the influence of Protestantism is to ask, how many Ivy League universities were founded by Protestants? Well, here, how many? All 8 of them were founded by Protestants, some with more direct influence, like Harvard, Yale, or Princeton. Others, though, definitely like Cornell, Penn, were founded with Protestant influence. So I just sort of started here by talking about, in general terms, the contributions that many scholars would talk about Protestantism in U.S. culture. The idea of the freedom of inquiry, particularly the idea that it is important to resist unjust authority. So we'll see this as we go along, even starting tonight with Luther, who started out wanting to reform the Catholic Church, but ultimately felt like it was his responsibility, that it was his conscience to reject it altogether. This freedom of inquiry also includes the freedom of speech. And again, this idea of resisting unjust authority. Reform and renewal, the whole idea of reformation, renewal, the importance of the need to reform religious institutions and also social and political ones. Another contribution, another aspect of Protestantism that's been highly influential is the idea of individualism, and the idea that an individual has their own independent, autonomous relationship with God that really changes the relationship between an individual Christian and the church. Also, the idea that Christianity needs to be voluntary, that you are not necessarily born into it, but you need to make a voluntary commitment to it as a young person or even as an adult. That has led in the US to religious freedom and religious pluralism. One of the jokes I've often heard is that, where 2 Protestants are gathered, you're going to have at least 3 different denominations. So the okay, I think I'm still sharing and still unmuted. I'm figuring out how this webinar thing goes. As well, the importance of literacy, with the idea that you need to read the Bible on your own, with the idea we'll get to in a minute of sola scriptura. There is an importance of being able to read and write. That leads to the importance of education. Although, interestingly, there's been a pronounced anti-intellectualism among particularly evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants. Protestants have also harped on or emphasized a sense of their chosenness. That they are, say, the Puritans believed that they were kind of the chosen people of God, similar to the Old Testament Hebrews, that they've been chosen for a special mission in the United States. That has led to the flip side of chosenness, which is often a self-righteousness, a sanctimoniousness, a feeling that we're right and everybody else is wrong. And that has led to oppression in many different cases. Uh, um, let's see. Utopianism and apocalypticism has been rife in the United States as an influence of Protestantism. The utopianism, the idea of founding millennialism, that Jesus, God has a plan for humanity that will lead to a golden age, a utopia, a new Jerusalem, a new Eden. And that utopianism is often associated with the end of the world, a kind of apocalyptic sense that the world is soon to be ending, and that for those chosen few, it will open into a kind of new Eden, a utopian Christian society. And then lastly, who can forget the Protestant work ethic and Max Weber's famous 1905 volume, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. This Protestant work ethic means that the Protestantism has been associated with discipline, with hard work, with frugality, and particularly the idea that divine blessing results in material prosperity, or that material prosperity reflects divine blessing. So, meaning that the rich are there because God put them there. You can imagine some of the issues that might raise and that we will be talking about as we go on. But this Protestant work ethic has been particularly important in emphasized in the United States. Um, who are these people? Well, I just, picked up the most recent figures that I could find, that 23% of the 62% of US adults who identify as Christian identify somewhere as evangelical. We'll talk more about this in terms of the development of evangelicalism, but basically, evangelical means born again. So, born again Christianity are evangelicals. Most, but not all, Baptists, pretty much all Pentecostal, holiness groups, Adventists. Pentecostal would be like the Assemblies of God. Holiness might include the Church of the Nazarene, is a well-known holiness group. The Seventh-day Adventists. Most non-denominational groups are also evangelical. The non-denominational groups really began first starting in the 1950s, but really getting going in the 1970s and 80s. Those would be churches that do not affiliate with one of the other Protestant denominations, like Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, etc. So they have names like Calvary Chapel, Flood. The Rock Church is one of the largest churches here, and non-denominational churches here in San Diego. So non-denominational churches, Saddleback is a huge non-denominational church in Orange County. So, non-denominational Protestantism is often affiliated or associated with mega churches, those individual congregations that have more than 2,000 members. And the idea of non-denominational were in the 1950s, these groups wanted to kind of break through what they saw as the narrowness and the bickering and infighting among Protestants, and they wanted to kind of reject these denominational fights and be, non-denominational Christians. In the process, many of them have formed what are essentially denominations. So there are networks of rock churches across the United States, but non-denominational or mega churches is how they are usually known. Restorationist Protestants are those Protestants who want to restore what they understand is biblical Christianity. Denominations that are associated with the Restorationist movement are the Christian Churches Disciples of Christ, the Churches of Christ, most of them, and the Christian churches. A much smaller percentage, just under half, of those who identify themselves as Christian identify as what are called mainline Protestants. That would include most but not all Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians slash Anglican, and Congregationalists. Also, I should have included the Reformed groups like Dutch Reform, Swiss Reform, German Reform. I was just going to mention Congregationalists are most well known. Their denominational name is the United Church of Christ. Church of Christ is in so many of these groups' names, it's really hard to keep them apart sometimes. About 5% of US Christians identify as Black Protestants, and they are in different denominational groupings that affiliate with Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal, and Holiness. They comprise about 2/3 of the Black community in the United States, and we'll be talking more about them in a couple of weeks. If you're interested, this contrasts with about 19% of the 62% of adults who identify as Catholic, 2% as Mormon, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Orthodox churches, say Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, less than 1% Jehovah's Witnesses. That other 1% would include Christian Science. And I just want to mention that Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Christian Science are not usually included within kind of the Protestant umbrella. They do not see themselves as Protestant, and most scholars would not see them as Protestant either. Just if you're interested, I looked up the statistics for other groups. About 7% of US adults in this 2024 survey at the Pew Research Center, which is a great source for reasonably good statistics, about 2% Jewish, 1% Muslim, 1% Buddhist, 1% Hindu, and 2% other of the world's religions. But what's super interesting is that 29% of adults identify themselves as not religiously affiliated at all. This group that religious scholars in, the bad attempt that religion scholars usually have about humor, they're generally called the nuns. Not the N-U-N-S kind, but the N-O-N-E-S kind. This group, the 29% of the not affiliated, the nuns, some are agnostic, some are outright atheists, some would say they're spiritual but not religious. But this is the non-religious are the single fastest growing religious group in the United States today. They've been growing by leaps and bounds. So this is kind of who we're talking about. And again, the about 34%, so just over half of Christians in the US identify themselves as Protestant. Just to kind of set the stage, I'm a religious historian, so I tend to think kind of chronologically. So I wanted to go back to the beginnings of the Protestant Reformation in Western Europe. The context for the Reformation is the Renaissance, and just kind of giving you. I'm not really big on dates, but I like the idea of, kind of giving you some chronological coat hangers to kind of have an idea of, kind of the period of time that we're looking at. Again, this is Western Europe, Italy, Spain, France, the UK, Germany. You got the idea. So, two things that are particularly important about the Renaissance. We think of Renaissance art or the Mutant Ninja Turtles and their names of, Michelangelo and Titian, etc. So we think in terms of art and the humanities. This was really saw a shift from a theocentric, from a God-centric understanding of the universe to a more human-centered. So again, we see this in art and architecture, this shift to a kind of humanism, a focus on human beings as the center of the universe, as being able to figure things out on their own. This is pre-Enlightenment, but you can see how it's sort of going to move into the Enlightenment in several hundred years. So it is a shift to looking at human beings as the center of artistic, intellectual, and social inquiry. This was accompanied by, like I say here, economic, political, and cultural changes. We're moving from a largely agricultural to a more mercantile economy in Western Europe. We see the beginnings of the rise of nation states, of people not, identifying themselves not with their local community, I'm from Saxony or I'm from Burgundy, but seeing themselves, I'm French, I'm English. So we'd see monarchies in particularly France and Great Britain emerging during this period. And a different sense of citizenship, a different sense of identity. So that tends to undermine the idea of being part of one universal Catholic Church and being more associated with a nation rather than a town or a region. And then lastly, super important, the printing press. Many scholars have speculated that if the printing press had not been invented, Martin Luther would likely have been executed as a heretic, like many were before him. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting names at the moment, but I can look them up. I try to be pretty good at acknowledging when I don't remember something, but I will look it up and then get back to you. But the major figure for the Protestant Reformation, usually regarded as the founder, certainly major figure who he wasn't the first, but he was the one who managed to stay alive. I give you his birth and death dates here. His early life, there's been really interesting scholarly work done on Luther's early life. He grew up kind of middle class at that time. His father really wanted Luther to be an attorney. Luther was a dutiful son. He started law school, even though he didn't like it. And how he shifted into becoming a priest and a monk, there are different stories about how that took place. But the one I like the best is, Luther is a young man. He's riding his horse at night and he gets caught in a thunderstorm. The lightning is coming down. He's afraid he's going to be struck by lightning. And he screams, "Oh, help me, Saint Anna! If you save me, I will become a monk." And as the story goes, some scholars stand by it, others don't. It sounds a little bit too good to be true, but as the story goes, Luther kept to that promise. It certainly would be an easier way to sell the idea to his parents. It sounds like, I'm not going to be a lawyer because God called me to be a monk. He becomes a member of the Augustinian order. He leaves behind the study of law and becomes a professor of both biblical studies and theology. Let me see if I've said everything I want to say there. Oh, yeah. He became a professor at the University of Wittenberg in Germany, and as a young monk, he described being absolutely miserable, being in despair. He was constantly worried about the state of his soul. He, kind of wanted to be the best monk he could be. He prayed constantly. He received the sacraments. He went to confession, but he was really plagued, tormented, we might even say, by the idea of not knowing if he was going to go to heaven or not. And sort of, was he doing enough? And this ultimately leads him to ask, kind of, what do I need to do in order to be saved? And is what the church doing adequate? Is it enough? Am I doing enough? And is the church doing enough? And that leads to his conflict with Johann Tetzel, who came to Wittenberg, as they say, about 1515, and began a practice of selling what were called indulgences. This was in order to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And an indulgence was a piece of paper, you can find it online if you want to see what one looks like, that would grant the purchaser or someone who the purchaser designated a period of time out of purgatory. And so as maybe some of you know, as a non-Catholic, I had to learn that for those who die with unforgiven sins, they do not go directly to heaven, but they go to a place, a kind of location called purgatory. It's been called a lobby, a waiting room, but it's where your soul stays until other people pray for you, until your soul's sins are forgiven. And boy, I can hear some of you who are experts in Catholic theology saying, oh my gosh, she's really got this wrong. Well, I'm going with it at any rate. But the idea that other people could pray for you to have your sins forgiven in order to go to heaven. Well, the Johann Tetzel sold indulgences. These were, again, you would pay a bunch of money or pay an amount of money to get yourself you sort of prepaid. If you died with unforgiven sins, you would already have time out of purgatory, or those of your deceased loved ones. And you can sort of hear how, approaching someone who is recently bereaved, and Tetzel would say, don't you want to save your loved one from spending any time away from God's presence in heaven? It only costs a few, francs, a few marks, a few euros, we'd say today. And you can help them spend eternity in heavenly bliss in the presence of the Father. To Luther, this was an exploitive practice. He totally objected to it. He felt like, you're not getting anything for your money except a piece of paper. And he really objected to this. And when Tetzel's big slogan was, make sure I have it right here, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. It's not kind of like Nike and just do it, but it it was a slogan that Tetzel used, and Luther just hated this practice. And so he wrote what came to be known as the 95 Theses. So these were 95 objections to the practices of the church. And again, just to remember, Luther's not a Protestant yet. He is a faithful Catholic. He wants to reform the church. And he really, not all of the 95 Theses are about indulgences, but many of them are, and about this practice that he saw as manipulative, as exploitive, and as just plain sinful. As the story goes, and again, scholars disagree on this. The story goes that he nailed the 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517. If you need to have a date for the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, this is the date that is most often given. Of course, it's a lot more complicated than that, but if you need a date where it starts. So again, like I said, Luther's first idea was to reform the church from within. But it doesn't take long for Pope Leo by 1521. Well, no, let me back up. The 95 Theses were printed. Gutenberg had been doing his thing. The Gutenberg Bible was in the 1450s. So the 95 Theses were printed, they were widely distributed, they were widely read. And so more people began asking some of the same questions that Luther had. Pope Leo X gets wind of it, and in 1520 and 1521, he excommunicates Martin Luther and declares him a heretic. This was really formalized at the Diet of Worms. I used to say in class that, this is not a meal plan where you're eating worms, but the Diet of Worms was it was a civic gathering called by the Holy Roman Emperor. And it would, because of the close relationship between the church and politics during this time, or at least with the Holy Roman Empire, the Diet of Worms calls Luther and basically asks him two questions. Did you write these books and these 95 Theses, and do you stand by what you have written? Luther refuses to recant. Oh gosh, I have a good quote here. He says at the 1521 Diet of Worms, I am bound by the scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. May God help me. Amen. So the Edict of Worms declares Luther not only a heretic, but an outlaw, says that he is going against the law, and he should be that he should be taken prisoner by the civil authorities and taken to jail and probably executed as his progenitors who had looked for reform within the church, what had happened to them. Luther has friends in high places, and he is able to escape detection. He dons disguises. All the time, though, he is continuing to study the scriptures. He continues to think. And now that he's excommunicated and has been declared a heretic and an outlaw, religiously, ecclesiastically, as well as politically and socially, he just keeps on going, thinking about what are the things that are wrong with the church. He rejects clerical celibacy, and in 1525, he marries a former nun named Catherine von Bora. He helps these nuns escape from their convent. And again, scholars have mixed reports on whether or not it was a happy marriage or whether she was kind of more the hospitality hostess for all the people who wanted to see Luther later on in his life. The term Protestant wasn't coined until a few years later when a series of princes, kind of political leaders who saw, I wonder if we could get ahead politically if we declared ourselves independent of the church. We're going to align ourselves with Luther's idea. We are going to protest the practices and the beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church. And this idea of protest being like I said in the beginning, kind of the spirit of dissent, the spirit of resistance to the status quo. Apparently, especially if the status quo is not what you agree with, that is this idea of protesting. Luther's followers ultimately became known as Lutherans, and so there are several Lutheran denominations today that have Lutheran in their name. The American Lutheran Church, the Evangelical Lutheran, the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Christian Church, I think, or ELCA. I should look that up. But so the Lutheran groups today follow the beliefs and practices of Luther. So I just had a couple of things I wanted to say about Luther's ideas. And we'll see this. This is the first time I'm using this kind of way to divide up a Christian, or you can really do it with any belief system. But in kind of the theology or dogma or doctrinal aspect of the faith, the ethical or moral aspect of the faith, the ritual or worship aspect of a faith, and kind of the organizational, the community, the leadership aspect of a faith. So again, I did not come up with this way of kind of parsing a religion. Actually, I think Catherine Albanese, who taught for many years at the University of California, Santa Barbara, I think came up with it. But this, I find, is just a kind of easy and convenient way to divide up a religion into its component parts. It's not perfect. Certainly, there is a lot of blurring, across these different categories, but let's just use them. Hopefully, they'll be more helpful than not helpful, kind of in just a more heuristic way to talk about the components of a religion. So, looking at the main aspects of Luther's theology, the two main pillars are sola scriptura and sola fide. This comes from Latin, the idea of the Bible alone and faith alone. So for Luther, the Bible, not the Pope, not church councils, not the history of church teaching, not even reason. The Bible alone is the only standard for Christian belief and practice. What that's going to mean, an implication of that is people need to read the Bible on their own. And so I said a few minutes ago that, kind of literacy and education were promoted by this idea that you need to look to the Bible and only the Bible. Of course, as most of us probably know, there are multiple ways to interpret the Bible. And so that has led to all these splits over the years among denominations and among different Protestant groups. So again, the Bible alone is the only authority for Christian belief and practice. With that is the idea of faith alone. And Luther gets this from his study of the book of Romans, particularly Romans 3. And he, again, I mentioned a few minutes ago how he was so despairing. How am I going to be saved? How am I going to know that I'm saved? How can I ever do enough to be saved? As Luther is agonizing with these questions, he comes up with this idea that salvation is only through faith. That being justified by God and being able to go to heaven is only through one's faith. Again, the Catholic Church was talking about faith and works and participating in the seven sacraments, but Luther does away with that. The issue of how do you get faith is one that Protestants have debated over the years, and we're going to see different solutions that they came up with starting next week. But this idea is that you are made right with God. That is, your sins are forgiven only by your faith. Now, in Luther's mind, works are a response to this justification. Doing good works happens after you are justified by faith. Sort of as a faithful disciple, you want to do good works, but they do not help you to get to heaven. Well, how do you get faith then? Luther says, faith is a gift given through God's grace. And so it's God's grace that gives believers faith, and through that faith, they are then made right with God. They are saved, their sins are forgiven, and then they can spend eternity in heaven. Again, Luther was not always a very precise theologian. Let me put it like that. And so how do you know if you have the grace and the faith or not? So some scholars have talked about this idea of sola fide and how you obtain faith as a kind of single predestinarian idea, that it's sort of those whom God chooses to give the gift of grace, or no, the gift of faith through God's grace, are kind of predestined for that. Luther doesn't go there explicitly, but this idea is going to be a problem again, how do you know you've been given, that God's grace has given you the gift of faith and therefore you are justified? Oh boy, John Calvin's going to answer that. We'll be talking about him next week. In terms of ethics and morality, Luther, again, forgiveness without indulgences, certainly that, and the idea that has been called confusingly to many, the priesthood of all believers. This does not mean that every individual Christian is ordained as a priest. No. What it means is that believers can confess their sins directly to God, and they can receive forgiveness directly from God. Another way to put it is that Luther does away with the sacrament of reconciliation or confession, that believers then act as their own priests. This leads to this kind of individualism that, it's less important if you are the member of the church. What's more important is that you have your own relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And that is this idea of justification by faith. So Luther gets rid of indulgences, through this priesthood of believers, gets rid of not only reconciliation, but in terms of ritual, to Luther, there are only two sacraments that Jesus participated in that are justified, that are discussed in the Bible. Those two sacraments are baptism and the Eucharist. So Luther takes the number of sacraments from 7 to 2. Again, the baptism and Eucharist are the only two that he says are validated in the Bible and that Jesus participated in them. Another issue that came from Catholic theology is the idea of transubstantiation, that the bread and the wine, through the consecration of the Eucharist, actually become the body and blood of Christ. That's typically called transubstantiation. Later Protestants are going to do away with this idea altogether, but Luther does what have been called consubstantiation. It's probably the most confusing way to go. That to Luther, the aspects of bread and body are both substances exist in the bread, this consubstantiation, both substances of breadness and Christ's bodiness are present in the bread, and that both the essence of wine or kind of wineliness and Christ's blood are present within the substance of the wine. Again, I think that's all I want to say about all I want to say about ritual life and worship. In terms of community and organization, Luther does not believe in papal authority. He believes in episcopal polity, that is church government by bishops. So it's not that he doesn't believe in hierarchy. He does. But he does not believe in the idea of, kind of the the keys to the kingdom, the inheritors, the descendants of St. Peter, etc. So no single authority for the entire church, but there is the government of bishops that come to, similar to Catholic bishops, that they supervise, they oversee. Episkopos comes from the Greek word for shepherd or overseer, that they shepherd or oversee particular geographical regions of Christians. Luther, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, does not believe in celibacy for either priests, monks, or nuns. So married clergy, we have a new role of the minister's wife, begins with Luther, and he also does not believe in monasticism. So the idea that Christians, both clergy and laity, need to be kind of in the world, of the world, and need to be involved in it, is an important part of his belief system. The thing I find most interesting, though, is this idea of a redefinition of the church. Let me look at my notes here, because this is so the function of the church is totally different with Luther. Under Roman Catholicism, you had to participate in the church in order to be involved in the sacraments. And that is true for Luther with baptism and Eucharist, but more and more, he describes the church as a gathered body of believers, a voluntary body of believers. Now, later reformers are going to take this idea and run with it. What Luther does is focuses more on the individual than the church, and talks about the importance of this kind of invisible body of believers. They are the church, rather than, in more Catholic terms, a more visible definition of the church. So again, this is going to set the stage for a lot, voluntarism, people calling themselves Christian and having almost or no relationship with a Protestant church. It's so interesting. Um, I think, yeah, I think that's what I want to wrap up a kind of Luther is well known for his anti-Semitic writings, and scholars debate whether Luther's ideas were a direct influence on the Nazis in World War II or not. But Luther was very unkind, really hated Jews. He wrote a book called The Jews and Their Lies, published in 1543. And just in response to the question, what shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? First, set fire to their synagogues or schools. Second, I advise that their houses should also be razed and destroyed. Third, their prayer books and Talmudic writings must be taken from them. Their rabbis must be forbidden to teach. So Luther's anti-Semitism, and he wasn't crazy about Muslims either, but he had kind of less to do with them. But he was aware of the Turks who were Muslim, condemned them as well, but not quite as explicit terms as he did with the Jews. There are other things that we could critique Luther on, but maybe I just want to say a word about the resources that I will put at the end of each session. This is really what I've tried to do is to put together a combination of the classics about the subject that we're talking about, and also some newer, more revisionist histories, just to give you, just to give you kind of the range of kind of, the tried and true that scholars always refer to. They're always refer to Sidney Alstrom. These are the folks that I was reading in grad school: Roland Bainton, William Klebsch, as well as some newer sources, so that you get an idea. I will also try to, I love images, and so we'll try to provide a sense of images. These are two of the better known pictures of Luther. Um, by all accounts, he loved his beer, he loved food, he was, maybe hedonistic is too strong a word to say, but he enjoyed worldly pleasures. Let's go with that. And I think I'm going to stop sharing there. I always want to provide time for questions, and I wasn't sure how many questions there might be. Um, yes, thank you. Here I'm looking. Oh, these are great. Okay.
Yeah.
Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, in the chat box, to raise your hand. I think either Matthew or Maria can help you out. One person says, not sure Luther believed in consubstantiation, more of a true presence, Christ in, with, and under the elements of the Eucharist. I think that's probably more accurate. Most scholars refer to this idea of the true presence as consubstantiation, but I think that your view is more specific and more technically correct. Absolutely. The Lutherans have confirmation. It is not considered a sacrament, but confirmation, Lutherans, not all Protestants do, but Lutherans baptize infants. And by baptizing infants, they are They're in the church, but they're not truly Christians until they are confirmed. That is, that they can take on this idea of justification by faith, that they can say themselves, yes, Jesus saved me. I want to be a Christian. It is not considered a sacrament, but no, that's a great question. Lutherans marry, not considered a sacrament though. But most Protestants who do have infant baptism, and not all do, some have what they call believers' baptism. We'll talk about some of them next week. But Lutherans consider confirmation an ordinance. So if you want to be a full member of the church, you need to go through confirmation, but it is not a sacrament. What was the basis from the Bible for Luther's dislike of the Jews? Well, the easy answer is for Luther, the Jews killed Jesus. Luther certainly acknowledged that Jesus was a Jew. But he really, again, like many later Protestants and other Christians as well, he talks about the deep sin of the Jews by not that they did not recognize that Jesus was the Christ. And only a small number did, but the majority rejected Jesus as the Christ. And the fact that, again, to Luther, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, technically, the Romans killed Jesus. Nothing could happen without the Romans. But this idea of the Jews being kind of co-conspirators in the execution of Jesus of Nazareth. That's where it comes up. Another great question. Did Luther want to leave the Catholic Church, or was he eventually excommunicated? He was excommunicated in 1521 by Pope Leo X. And by Luther's own account, he started out with this idea, his conflict with indulgences and Johann Tetzel, that he wanted to get rid of the practice of indulgences, and that he wanted to reform the church, that he wanted to remain a faithful Catholic. But after he was excommunicated, and then after he was declared basically an enemy of the state, but in the Edict of Worms, there was no going back. And Luther just continued to take these ideas and run with them far beyond the issue of indulgences alone.
Ev, I have a question for you. Well, maybe not a question, but while you were talking, especially about the abolishment of monasticism and the desire, I think you said that that Christians should be involved in the world. I mean, do you think that Luther was vindicated at the Second Vatican Council? When because I was listening to you and I was thinking, well, I mean, we had been so separated, and the joys and the sorrows of the world, Gaudium et Spes, all the things that happened at the Second Vatican Council were kind of an attempt at a rapprochement between believers and the world. And you mentioned that, and I was wondering, so just in general, do you think any of Luther's ideas have been vindicated over the course of the last 400, 500 years now, especially at Vatican II?
That's a great question. And I didn't mention it, but I should have. Absolutely. I think that many of Luther's ideas have been vindicated. They've been adopted in some ways by the Catholic Church, certainly in Vatican II, even as beginning with kind of the Counter Reformation and the Fourth Lateran Council. This, and certainly I was reading today, I think it was 2008, the church actually, the magisterium came out and said, it is faith and works, and said, really, we have no beef with Luther. That the Protestant and Catholic understandings of, kind of, it is faith that motivates works, and it is where both Protestant and Catholic churches are now. I did think it was interesting, though, that Luther's excommunication has never been lifted.
Wow.
But I think you're absolutely right. There and I mean, we could debate kind of how much this was like a more theological movement and how much was kind of more of a political movement, as more and more people started adopting Luther's ideas, more and more places in Western Europe, and here we're starting Germany, we got Switzerland, we're going to go to the UK, adopt Protestant ideas. But absolutely, I think today Catholic and Protestant theologians would pretty much all agree on the relationship between faith and works that Luther had such a big time with.
Mm. I think we have a fifth and a sixth question. How did Luther view the other reformers like John Calvin? Did they ever meet in person? They contem
Great question. And they did not meet. I am going to double check that. I don't know for sure. Um, I know I got my Calvin notes sitting around here because that's what we're going to look at next week. I just want to, I Calvin. They did not meet, but I do know that I'm not sure. I will look up what Luther thought of Calvin. Calvin thought that Luther was a very broad, imprecise, ambiguous theologian. And so Calvin in the institutes, a compact 500-page volume you could carry around. So Calvin really says, we need to systematize this Luther stuff. We need to make it more rigorous, more clear, more specific, more logical. Calvin did have legal training. So again, I will look up a Luther and Calvin, what Luther thought of Calvin, but Calvin really did not think that Luther was rigorous and systematic enough.
and there's another one there. Would Luther be okay with the Catholic Church today?
Ooh, that's kind of related to your question, Maria. I actually think if Luther saw what is being done in his name today, he'd be rolling in his grave. So I think that Luther would be far more content with the Catholic Church of today than he
Wow.
would be with many of what the reformers are doing. What other reform groups are doing. They've just, really, the idea that each person can basically come up with their own Christian theology by reading the Bible on their own. Um, that was so far from Luther's ideas. He did believe in authority. He did believe in polity. He did not believe in every Christian believer just running off and believing whatever they want. So I think that's a great question. How much did this is a great question. How much did Luther's anti-Jewish writings influence or were employed by Nazi propaganda?
Oh,
Scholars disagree on this question. Some say there was pretty much a direct influence to Hitler, and I guess the Fourth Reich, and some would say no, it was kind of vague, kind of in the air. So again, this is a topic that is debated. Certainly, the fact that Luther's ideas did spread, and his ideas certainly were shared by the majority of Protestants. Um, I think absolutely contributed to a sense of hostility and antagonism toward the Jews across Europe. But kind of the direct influence on Nazism, again, it depends on who you read.
Mhm. Evelyn, I have another question based on
Yeah.
something you said. You talked about at some point, and I'm exactly sure how you said it. I wrote it down that, it was almost possible to be a Protestant without any relationship to the church. That's what you said. And I was
Yeah.
wondering, is that kind of like, has that influenced, is that in the background of a lot of what people say today about I'm spiritual? But I'm not religious, meaning, but I don't affiliate with the church.
Mhm.
So, I mean, do you see that as being a way of being in a relationship with God and the world that has persisted from that time up into our own day? That's the
Yes,
question.
absolutely. And so it is Luther that kind of develops this you don't need the church. And again, if you're going to participate in baptism and the Eucharist, but you don't need the Eucharist in order to be justified. You don't need, and so I think that absolutely there is a direct line through line from Luther's notions of individualism to later Protestants, and then people who are just like, I don't want to be affiliated at all, but I still believe in God,
Right,
and but I have
right,
no relationship with organized religion. I do want to say very quickly, though, that the stated reasons for not affiliating tend to be more with the political and social attitudes of the church, or attitudes that Christian churches are too judgmental. But I think you're absolutely right, Maria, that that shift that Luther begins ends up be allowing, yeah, again, these 500 years later, 500 plus years later, to people saying, oh, I believe in God, but I'm not a member of a church, mosque, or synagogue. Absolutely. Okay, let's see. It seems to me the Catholic Church enabled the Reformation but abhor the split. I think that's pretty true. Again, the it's really hard to tell. I mean, again, Luther started out wanting to reform the church, but he also was not willing to back down. He was not willing to, violate his conscience, as he said, and his interpretation of the Bible. Um, so in that way, being, but the experience of the Catholic Church before this point was that, you declare, gosh, what, William Tyndale or Jan Hus, you call him a heretic, you arrest him, you burn him at the stake. And so this was so that I think the church was following that older script, but in part because Luther had friends in high places and he was able to escape being arrested. Also, because the printing press got those 95 theses much more well distributed than Jan Hus and Tyndale and others. That meant that the church had to find a different way to deal with Luther. So he was excommunicated. Um, so I would say, in a way, the Catholic Church enabled the Reformation, but certainly, doesn't like the split, particularly when Protestantism becomes a rival to Catholicism. Do I think folks need a church? Well, I'm a big believer in a community of faith and participating with other people. So I guess I would say, yeah, Christian folks. I think one's spiritual life is certainly nurtured, advanced, and benefited by participating in community with other Christians. Was the idea of faith alone a singular event or a gradual theological evolution? Oh, this is another great question. It's a little bit of both. Isn't that a great academic answer? It's not this or that, it's both. I know. I'm really good at giving the vague, ambiguous answer. I think it is more accurate to say that it was a more gradual evolution from Luther's reading of the Bible. Boy, you can tell it's starting to get dark here. I'm going to turn on a light and I hope it doesn't mess us
Thanks.
up. Okay. Yeah, it's dark where many of you are. It's starting to get dark here in Southern California. Um, so was Luther tormented by this kind of spiritual despair? Yes. Was he looking for some way to validate or justify or even accept that he was saved? Absolutely. So, in that way, it's kind of this singular emotional event. But coming up with faith alone was more of an evolution based on his study of the Bible.
Mhm. Do you
These
have any?
questions are great. Thank you so much.
Do we have any other questions? We're coming on towards 8:15. This is not a question, but when you were talking about how uh, his 95 theses were published and disseminated, I was thinking, the Gutenberg Press was kind of like social media of our own day. If it weren't for that, they would have been just pieces of paper that probably would have, wrinkled up in the rain on the
Yeah,
door. But the
yeah,
possibility of this new form of dissemination is probably what got him in trouble with Pope Leo the 10th, was it?
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Otherwise, it probably would have
Yeah.
been a very small thing in Wittenberg, and that was it. But anyway, to
Yeah.
everyone who's here tonight, I told you that Evelyn is a very, very interesting, insightful, passionate, and a favorite teacher. So I hope you enjoyed. I think one more question come in. Evelyn, do
Yeah.
you want to
Yeah.
take that? What are the
Yeah.
key?
Key differences between Luther's view of the Eucharist, this consubstantiation, and the Church's view of transubstantiation. As I understand it, and I am not a ritual scholar, in the Catholic view, the elements of the bread and the wine actually cease to exist and they
Correct.
become the body and the blood of Christ. But for Luther, kind of the essence of bread and the true essence of the body are there together. There's not a complete kind of metamorphosis. And in the same vein, kind of the essence of wine and of blood, the real presence is there, but it doesn't displace or replace the wine and the bread within the Eucharist.
Mhm.
There's probably a better technical way to explain that, but I'm not sure what it is.
It's good. It's great. All right, well, we're going to wrap it up tonight. I look forward to next week. I'm sure, as you all do, bring your
Yes.
friends. You'll have the opportunity to view this if you want on the YouTube channel. Thank you for Evelyn. And tonight, as we leave, I always try to put our lives in context. We're living tonight in a world of great consternation about what is going on in society, about the death of Miss Good, about the protests that are going on in our country. Protesting is big in the United States tonight. So wherever you are and whatever you believe, doesn't matter. But I think we can all be joined in some kind of prayerful consideration of the people who are frightened tonight of being dragged from their homes, separated from their husbands and their children, and join with all other people who think that what is happening is certainly inhumane, not at all Christian, and ask for the God of peace and wisdom to bring some wisdom and insight into the world in which we live for the common good. So, all of this through Christ our Lord. See you all next Tuesday. Ev, it's great to see you again, and I look forward to next week. Bye now. Good night, everybody.